Good morning, everybody. So today my class is going to be on how to hook up a condenser and all the steps to do so from start to finish. Enjoy. So first we're going to take the homemade feet we made out of just a bolt, a nut, and 2 washers, attach those to all the feet, and we're going to tighten those up to make sure the unit is secured to the bracket. After we get the feet in, make sure the unit is where we want it, and then we just tighten it up. Perfect, and that's it. And the tools you'll need for that would be a 7/16 deep socket, and any pair of channel locks will do. After the unit is snugged down to the bracket, after that you can start taking covers off. And then be sure just not to lose the screws because they're pretty small and hard to find. Drop that one. We'll also take the electrical cover off now as well, just because it'll be in our way later when we go to do that. And after the covers are off, you can start taking the nuts and all that off, the flare connectors, and from the part where you open the valves from. And then with these, when you take them off, just be sure to try not to drop them to get any dirt inside of the threads. Anything like that could affect the pipes the way it would be fitting onto the unit. Once you have all the nuts off, just put them in the same safe spot that you put all the screws from the covers, just so you don't lose anything. Now that we have all the nuts and covers off, we can go ahead and line these pipes up, size them, and get them cut to fit. So I always like starting on the bottom one first, that way you just work your way up through the condenser and you won't have to go backwards and work over top of yourself. And then when you bend the pipe, always make sure that you try to keep it to the wall as much as you can. That way the exposed pipe isn't sticking out for the house, making it kind of look ugly. So once you get it about sized right, you just cut the insulation off the pipe right behind where it's going to connect, where these threads start. That way you have the insulation running all the way up to the nut and there's not too much exposed copper left over. After you cut that insulation, go to the first thread, usually about to the first, second one, and then that's where you make a score mark. And then that's where you use your pipe cutters and start flaring it from that cut mark. Make sure you keep the leftover copper so you can recycle it at the shop later. Once you have that pipe cut, you can pull back on the insulation. Make sure you put the nut over that. Can't flare without the nut on there. Get your flare tool set up and then use it as a guide, and it'll have a preset diameter on how far the flare will go in. And then make sure when you flare, it's always facing down. That way the copper burrs will never go back into the pipe. And then after you flare the pipe, always inspect your flare and run your finger around it. Make sure there's no burrs or anything that might affect the way it connects to the condenser. then from there, you just line it up to the valve on here, making sure it fits nice and smooth. And as long as it's aligned, the pipe should thread right on. And then get your wrench and snug it up. Alright, so that one should be good, and you just rinse and repeat, and then do the same thing for the second one. And once again, always just double check your flare, make sure there's no any imperfections, no burrs or anything like that can cause a leak in the end. And as before, just snug it up. And this one is a 18 condenser, so it's going to have the 1/2 inch pipe and the 1/4 inch. The 1/2 inch, one thing to know about that, it's just very easy to kink. If you're doing something just a little above a 90, it will most likely kink if you're not careful. And a 1/4, it's very thin, just opposite of the 90. So if you're doing something like flaring and you turn it too much and you over torque it, you could split the flare and that'll cause a leak as well. You also want to be careful when you're tightening the 1/4 onto the unit, because if you over torque it with your wrench, not just the flare tool, you can separate the flare and then push it out from itself if you over tightening it. Alright, that's about good for the pipes. Alright, so now that the pipes are connected, typically this is a good time you can start leak checking. So you hook up your gauges to this valve right here and put in your about 350 to 400 psi, and you spray the bubbles among the connections, and I can show you guys that soon. But for now, we're going to continue with the installation of the condenser. So you grab one of these, it's going to be your electrical button, and you can put it right in this bottom hole right here, and that's where your wire is going to run through. Size up your wire before you're even pushing it through, that way you're not wasting time. I typically like to cut mine at a nice 45-degree angle just to push it through that button a little bit easier. And one thing is, you'd always like to come right behind the pipes, not going in front of them, because if you go in front of them, you'll cause a twist around them. My wire is now through the electrical button, and it is wrapped behind the pipes, that way it's not exposed. And you can size it up one more time to the connections itself and get yourself a rough cut, that way you're not stripping more than you need to. And from here, I like to use my front cutters to help start splitting it. One thing you want to be sure of when you're stripping the wires like this, just be careful where you're putting your hands, because if the front cutters were to slip or a piece of the strand were to break when you're pulling the wire, typically you end up punching the house, punching the foundation or the condenser, and it doesn't feel too great. Alright, once you strip the 3 wires in the ground out of everything, you can snip this off. Just be sure not to leave any extra wires in there and cut that too. And then typically from here, I like to just start my ground, and I'll put that in first so it just gets it out of the way. Put that in, twist around, and then snug it back up. I size the last 3 connection wires one more time, give it the last cut, and then you get the wire strippers, strip off about 1/4 inch. And then from here, it's pretty easy, kind of self-explanatory as long as you don't rush. Everything's color-coded. Once you finish wiring in the condenser to the head unit with the communication wire, make sure you give everything a quick pull test. That way nothing's going to fall out over time. And from there, it should be complete. All right, and once you have your pipes and all your electrical hooked up and connected, you can go ahead and start the leak test, which would be putting nitrogen into the system, spraying the connections with the bubbles, and then from there, if any bubbles come out, you have the leak, and you also want to watch the pressure, make sure it stays the same as when you set it. All right, so once you're ready to leak check the condenser you just hooked up, you attach the yellow hose to the nitrogen, and for now I attached my low side, so the blue hose, to the condenser itself to start the leak check. You make sure these valves are closed on your gauges. Open up the nitrogen all the way, make sure it's in test mode. All right. Now that the PSI we need, we can shut the nitrogen off, disconnect the yellow hose, hang it back on our gauges to keep any dirt out of it. And then when you're not using the nitrogen, always be sure just to set it out of your way and lay it sideways so it doesn't fall down. So now that there's nitrogen in the condenser and we're still remaining at the 300 PSI, we're still going to do our leak check with the bubbles. So to do that, you just pull back on the insulation, spray both sides of the flare nut, and at the same time wiggle the pipe to make sure that your flare is good and then nothing's going to come loose over time. So those look good down here, and then check the head unit connections up top as well. I still double check to make sure they're remaining at the 300 PSI that I set it to. And to check these connections up here, you just got to remove the line hide. And that'll expose your connections right here. And then do the same thing, spray the front side and the back side as well. Oftentimes the bubble can appear in seconds if it has a large leak, but if it's a small leak, sometimes you got to sit, watch it for about 30 seconds, make sure nothing appears. All right, what I just wanted to show you guys is the gauges on how it shows to -30 when it is in a vacuum, and that'll look something like this. So the low side is pulled into vacuum, showing at -30. If it was remaining at just the regular air pressure, it would still be at 0. One thing I just wanted to touch base on real quick, this right here is the options for your regulator. So you have off or test is what we typically use. Test is when you're putting nitrogen into the system, and you can use off like this. Open the nitrogen, and then you can check your PSI right here. So when you check it like that, then you just close the nitrogen back up and release it back to test. And that's how you check your pressure in there. All right. And because we leak checked the whole system and now we're currently on a vacuum, we know we have no leaks. We know everything's going smooth. The unit's just about ready to be completely finished. We're just going to throw the cover pieces back on, and that'll include putting fiberglass in the holes and siliconing them as well. All right, once you're at your hole and you're ready to get filling it, grab your fiberglass insulation and just start shoving it in there, making a nice barrier between the interior and the exterior. And then with the silicone, you'd always like to start at the bottom. And work your way up. Touch a little more on the edges if you have to. And from there, your hole's complete. I also just want to show you what tools it'll take to hook up a full condenser to the head unit and everything included. And it'll be from start to finish. And so first you need your channel locks and a 7/16 deep socket to mount the unit to the bracket. After that, you'll need a drill to just take off the covers. You could also use a screwdriver if you need it. You'll need a wrench to take off the pipe connections and the flare nuts. And then after that, you move into the hooking the pipes up themselves. And you'll need some sort of utility knife to cut through the insulation, your pipe cutters to cut the pipe itself, and your flare tool to hook them up. After you hook up the pipes and you work your way to the communication wire, a few things you'll need would be a pair of front cutters, and wire strippers. And then besides that, for the electrical and the communication wire, you're just going to need a screwdriver to hook it to the condenser. Yes, sir. All right, so to take the condenser off vacuum, you grab the gauges and you're gonna tighten the low side, that way you close the manifold, and then you'll shut off the vacuum. And then after that, you're gonna go to the valves, put it right in this top one, be the gas side, and then at the same time you wanna make sure you watch the gauges and make sure that they crack to positive pressure. All right, and then after they go to positive pressure, you know you're not in a vacuum anymore, and you can remove the hose. And after you remove it, you just want to make sure that you open the valves all the way. All right. After you open the valves all the way, you want to put the covers back on those. And then after you put the covers back on by hand, you want to make sure you snug them up with a wrench, because it will leak through these if they are not tight. And then for your last cover piece, you're just going to slide these plastic knobs into the slits on a condenser. Make sure the top is pushed in and slide that up as well, and it'll go right into place. And you sink these last two screws.
Logan, can you wipe that clean for me? You see that? You see it though?
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you didn't notice, like if you didn't know what to look for, you wouldn't notice anything.